Rising 5.5 miles above sea level towers the highest point on Earth, Mount Everest. To reach the summit is one of the great goals of human achievement. But 50 years after Everest was first conquered, it has become a tourist mountain. Every year, guided expeditions take increasing numbers of climbers up its slopes. On May the 10th, 1996, 16 guided climbers fought their way to the top of the world. But as they struggled to descend, a violent storm blew in. Blinded by snow, out of oxygen and beyond the reach of rescue, they were exposed to the full fury of the mountain. Within 24 hours, 5 climbers were dead, victims of the ferocious weather surrounding them. Using reconstruction and dramatic archive of Everest expeditions in 1996 and 7, this film pieces together the tragic events of 2 days on the merciless upper slopes of the mountain. The Nepalese call Everest Sagamata, goddess of the sky. But this is no benign deity. For every 8 people who reach the summit, 1 dies in the attempt. When Sir Edmund Hillary and Sherpa Tenzing conquered Everest in 1953, they were fated for their superhuman tenacity and courage. But just half a century later, the lucrative commercial mountaineering industry attempts to get as many of its clients to the top as possible.
When Everest was first climbed, it was a totally mysterious mountain, a huge challenge, and only the very best climbers from around the world would actually venture upon it. And then it became just a tourist mountain, and yet a tourist mountain with a potential for being lethal.
At 29,000 feet, the summit of Everest is roughly the height of an aeroplane's cruising altitude. To climb this high, mountaineers must push their bodies to the limit. At 25,000 feet, the climber enters what is known as the death zone, where the air is almost too thin to survive. There is no margin for error. Altitude sickness, dehydration or exposure can kill within a few hours. Survival this high is a race against the clock.
You're so far removed from any possible help. You know, you twist your ankle and you could die because of that. You know, for instance, you take your glove off for a heartbeat to pull up a zipper. Your hand is frozen.
1996 was a bumper year for the burgeoning guided climbing industry.
Okay, most of this is self-evidence because you've got it on by now, but I'll read it anyway.
To gain a place on an expedition up Everest, an applicant would simply need some climbing experience and about £35,000. In May that year, 2 groups of 8 mountain tourists planned to attempt the summit on the same day. One group was led by Rob Hall, an Everest veteran from New Zealand. A member of his team was Doug Hansen. Hansen was now on his 2nd attempt. He had joined Hall's expedition the previous year, but failed to summit.
Doug was a postal worker, wasn't a rich person, had of course been there the previous year and hadn't got to the top, had actually, I think, used all his savings, had borrowed money and absolutely everything to realise his dream of actually standing on top of Everest. And I think Rob, being the warm-hearted soul that he was, desperately wanted Doug to succeed.
The other team would be guided by Scott Fisher, a climber from Seattle who had summited Everest only once before. After 4 weeks acclimatizing at base camp, the 2 expeditions set off on their journey. With guides and Sherpas, a total of 33 people would attempt to reach the top on the same day. planned to climb the 11,000 feet from base camp to the summit in 4 days. At the end of each day, they would rest at a camp higher up the mountain. First, the climbers would be guided through the Khumbu Icefall, a treacherous stretch of glaciers and crevasses. It would be a tough climb to reach Camp 1 at 19,600 feet. For Lena Gammelmann, a 34-year-old Danish climber, it was the first test of her endurance.
It takes you between 6 and 9 hours to get to Camp 1, and you are absolutely exhausted. And every step on the way you have to really make calculated decisions to do the right thing, not to fall into a crevasse or fall down a snow wall or lose your grip on one of the ropes, etc. It's an expedition in itself and pretty risky also.
As the altitude increases, even the most experienced climbers feel the life being squeezed out of them.
As you get higher, your body is steadily but imperceptibly deteriorating. You've really got to force yourself to put one foot in front of the other, and I think most people, I know I do, I set myself goals, and they're pretty modest. It's like 10 paces without a rest. And you count them, and you get up to 8, and you desperately want to stop, but you force yourself on 9, 10, and then you probably slump into the snow, and then you pant your heart out, and then you've got to start all over again.
After 3 days of climbing, the two expeditions reached Camp 4, the last before the summit. At 26,100 feet, they were now in the death zone.
I've never been that high before, never been in the death zone before. There is no margin. If you make the smallest mistake, then you're dead. You breathe as you normally do, and the air looks the way it normally does. You don't feel anything until your sort of teammates look at you and see that you're blue in your face because you're actually dying from lack of oxygen.
From Camp 4, it would take the climbers 12 hours to reach the summit and another 5 to get down, a total of 17 hours. Each climber would carry enough oxygen for just 18 hours, a survival margin of 1 hour. They would need to start the final ascent at midnight in order to reach the summit between midday and 1. Whatever happened, they had to be back at Camp 4 by 6 p.m. If not, they would run out of oxygen and daylight, and their chances of survival would be minimal. The climbers had one shot at glory, and timing was critical. At 11 p.m. on the night of May the 9th, 1996, after a few hours' rest, the 16 guided climbers got their wake-up call.
Okay, let's go.
Leaving 2 Sherpas to watch camp, they headed into the night.
We set out from camp towards midnight, spending the whole of the night until early in the morning, scrambling up the mountain, climbing ice walls, snow fields, very sort of mixed terrain and always excessively challenging.
5 hours into the climb, the 2 groups had formed one long line. But the extreme altitude was taking its toll, and the less experienced climbers were struggling, slowing those behind them. At 7 a.m., those too exhausted to continue were forced to turn back. Among the climbers who carried on were expedition leader Rob Paul and his client, postal worker Doug Hansen. The other expedition leader, Scott Fisher, was bringing up the rear, but he was struggling himself. At 9 a.m. they hit an obstacle at 27,000 feet. Because of a communication mix-up, ropes to assist them up the treacherous southeast ridge had not been fixed. Lacking the skills to climb unaided, the group had to wait for a guide to secure them. Time was ticking by.
There's a very, very dangerous traverse where you sort of have a very steep drop, 3 kilometers to Tibet on one side, 2 kilometers to Nepal on the other side. And that's very, very, very scary.
It was now 11 a.m. They'd just 2 hours left to reach the summit. But 300 feet from the top, the climbers hit another delay. They had reached the Hillary Step, a steep rock face rigged with only one fixed rope. They would have to ascend one by one. Each mountaineer would have to queue for almost an hour to take their turn. The 1 o'clock deadline to reach the summit was slipping away.
We could see with a telescope from Camp 2, we could look at the horizontal ridge from the south summit to the Hillary Step. We could see the people still going up. And by then it had been, 14 and a half hours into the climb, which is quite long.
At 2:15 p.m., Lena Gammelgar achieved her dream and reached the summit of Mount Everest.
Summiting gave me a feeling of massive contentment. No euphoria, no sort of expressive happiness or anything like that, but sort of a really calm contentment, as if something is falling into place.
But despite her sense of satisfaction, Lena's oxygen was running low. She was now dangerously behind schedule to return to Camp 4 before nightfall. At 3 p.m, she started her descent, but Lena wasn't the last. Team leader Rob Hall was still on the summit, waiting for his final client, Doug Hansen. It was Hansen's second attempt, and he'd spent £70,000 trying to realise a lifetime's dream. Hall wasn't about to turn him back. It was now 3:30. They were living on borrowed time. 11,000 feet below at base camp, journalist Audrey Salkeld spotted the danger that every mountaineer fears the most.
I cast my eye down the valley and there were these enormous clouds. It took me a minute to register what it actually meant. We were seeing just a spectacle, but higher on the mountain these clouds were going to hit with enormous force.
We could see the wind starting to increase, the plume off the summit, and it was getting dark and cloudy down below. It just had this ominous feeling. And I kept looking up thinking, turn around, time to turn around.
On May the 10th, 1996, 2 guided climbing expeditions were high on the upper slopes of Mount Everest. The 2 groups consisted of 16 clients, some with limited high-altitude experience. Each had paid thousands of pounds for the privilege of being ushered to the summit, but as they struggled down, a storm was brewing beneath them.
A lot of the clients are comparatively inexperienced. If everything goes well, if the weather's perfect, they're probably going to get to the top perfectly okay and get back down again. The problem is, though, if the weather is bad, they just haven't got the experience to actually get themselves back down.
With clouds gathering on the horizon, the leader of one team, Rob Hall, was still waiting for his final client, Doug Hansen, to reach the top. The second group leader, Scott Fisher, was only just beginning his descent, 1 hour behind his clients. At 4 p.m, 46-year-old postal worker Doug Hansen finally joined Rob Hall on the summit. He had worked double shifts to pay for the view before him. But after 16 hours of climbing, he was struggling to breathe and lacked the energy for the 5-hour descent. 5 times Everest veteran Rob Hall could do nothing to help him.
It takes 5 or 6 people to carry a person, and at those altitudes it's hard enough to move your own self rather than helping or dragging or lifting somebody else on difficult, dangerous, steep terrain.
Hall and Hansen now had only 2 hours of daylight left, and their oxygen was critically low. Hall radioed down the mountain for help, but at 29,000 feet, they were beyond the reach of rescue. His friends at base camp urged him to abandon Hansen and make his own way down. Hall refused.
People were saying, Rob is going to have to leave that client if he's to save himself. And it seemed so shocking.
Doug Hansen was going to die anyway. Rob, of course, had a wife who was pregnant back in New Zealand. But he made that judgment that I am responsible for this man. I'm not going to leave him while he's alive. And, you can't help respecting him for that.
But Hansen wasn't the only client at risk. Separated from their team leaders and desperate to reach camp before dark, 11 novice climbers were descending straight into a full-scale blizzard. Those safe in the camps below could do nothing but watch the weather front move in.
We could hear the wind howling off the summit. It's like jet aircraft taking off continuously. And it just looked and sounded horrendous.
70-mile-an-hour winds buffeted the mountain, and the temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. With darkness falling and their oxygen running out, Lina Gammelgar and 10 others were in a race against time.
Now this is the worst case scenario. You can't tell what's up or down or where you have the crevasses or the 3 kilometers drop to Tibet. You can't orientate yourself whatsoever, and you can't really move because there's so much new snow.
They struggled down the mountain for a further 4 hours and finally reached the flat expanse of the South Col, 1,000 feet from Camp 4. They were now tantalizingly close to safety, but totally disorientated.
Well, the South Col itself is relatively flat, and of course it's featureless. If the weather's clear, no problem at all. You can actually see the camp just over there. In a storm and a whiteout, though, you wouldn't see a thing. Your visibility is down to a few feet or nil.
It was now 8 p.m. The wind chill factor had dropped to 100 degrees below zero. The 11 desperate climbers had been pushing themselves against the clock for almost 20 hours. The oxygen cylinders which had been keeping them alive had now run out.
At this point, people had run out of oxygen, and what happens up there when you run out of oxygen is like sort of just pulling the plug. People, they just sit down, begin dying. We decided, okay, let's huddle up and see if we can keep each other warm, and let's see if at least some of us will survive the night. And that's where people, they are actually, dying.
Exhausted, frozen to the bone and barely breathing, they lacked the strength to fight on.
On a guided expedition, throughout that guiding experience, you've actually been positively discouraged from using your initiative. And suddenly, you're on your own, you're separated from the guide, in a screaming gale, you don't know what to do. And of course, some people, in effect, just gave up.
It's nothing you can buy, it's nothing you can practice. It's ultimately just like anywhere else in nature. Some are just stronger when you're faced with death.
As 5 of the climbers sat hunched in the snow, Lina and 5 others forced themselves forward in the desperate hope of reaching safety. By extraordinary luck, they chanced upon a tent and stumbled, more dead than alive, into camp. One of Scott Fisher's guides ventured out to locate the 5 clients still lost on the South Col. When he reached them, only 3 had the energy to walk. The other 2 were left for dead. The expedition was in chaos. More than 24 hours after the 2 groups had left for their summit bid, 2 people were dead and 4 were missing. Scott Fisher and a Sherpa had last been seen making their descent. Rob Hall and Doug Hansen were stranded just below the summit.
There's nothing we could do at that point. We were huddled around the radio for any type of news. And finally, about 4:30 in the morning, Rob Hall got on the radio.
Hall's years of high-altitude experience had allowed him to survive without oxygen. But beside him, Doug Hansen was dead.
Rob had been sitting out in the storm at 28,700 feet. I could imagine the condition he was in. I would assume his feet were frozen by then. The freezing was creeping up his legs. He was hypothermic. He was exhausted. He was just laying there stranded and physically probably couldn't get up and start moving. And then I got on the radio and started talking to him I went on 5 or 6 hours. I was like his closest friend at that point, and I did everything I could do, to motivate him, to make him laugh. I was telling him jokes, and also, but just saying, Rob, get up and start moving.
The storm continued to rage throughout the next day. At 5 p.m., Scott Fisher's body was found just an hour outside Camp 4. Rob Hall was still alive, but the high winds made it impossible to reach him. He was now facing his second night just below the summit of Everest. At 6:20 p.m, Base Camp patched through a call from Hall's wife in New Zealand.
We could hear them talking to each other, Rob and his wife, and it seemed rather intrusive. I think 1 or 2 people were crying. Rob said something like, "Sleep tight, speak to you tomorrow," but none of us really believed that.
How could this man survive another night, that altitude in this storm? He was being brave and optimistic as well, but I think all of us, and him included, probably knew that he wouldn't make it another night. And we just stood there and cried, it's like, God, what do? We can't do anything. And here's this man dying up there. And we felt so hopeless and helpless, unable to get to him fast enough.
The following day, the storm finally relented. There were no further radio communications from Rob Hall. He had died in the night at 28,000 feet. In total, 33 people had attempted to summit Mount Everest on the 10th of May 1996, and 5 had perished. The 2 most experienced climbers on the mountain disregarded their rigid schedule to offer their clients the top of the world. In the end, Everest, a mountain without mercy, punished them. But as long as the lure of the summit remains, inexperienced climbers will continue to trespass in the death zone.
Since '96, even more and more people are going to Everest. Rather than turning people off, it's turned people on. They've read about it, they think, wow, I could go, the possibility is there. And so the numbers have actually increased.
You get queues on the Hillary step, you get traffic jams, where people have to wait 1 or 2 hours. Well, all you need is another storm like the one you had in '96, and you'll get exactly the same kind of tragedy.